Hi, I'm Dr. Kurt Wohler for the Clostridia Mastery course. The title of this short video is Clostridia, Bacteria, and Candida Relationship. So the Clostridia Mastery course is offered through and sponsored by Integrative Medicine Academy. Integrative Medicine Academy is an online training academy of different mastery courses related to different topics of functional and integrative medicine. So for more information about our courses, go to integrativemedicineacademy.com or email us with questions to integrativemedicineacademy@gmail.com. So, often don't think about Candida as a fungus and Clostridia as a bacteria having some relationship, but both of these organisms can have overgrowth patterns within the digestive system. Candida in general is a commensal organism or a normal inhabitant of the digestive tract, but it's opportunistic and can become problematic. Some Clostridia or certain types of Clostridia could also be commensal, but there are pathogenic Clostridia too that are not. And so there's both scenarios can actually lead to different types of disease conditions. So we know that gastrointestinal candidiasis is much more common than people realize. So serious Candida infections can be life-threatening. The digestive system is the largest reservoir of Candida in the human body. Most people who have gastrointestinal candidiasis don't have a life-threatening infection, but they can have a number of different health problems, including an increased propensity for autoimmune disease. Now, there are various pathogenic mechanisms that Candida has. And so Candida produces different proteins that will allow it to adhere to an epithelial surface or invade an epithelial cell, like Candida lysin production, for example, can lead to destruction of epithelial cells. Candida can grow as hypha between epithelial cells, like the tight junction, and even translocate bacteria across the epithelial lining. One of the major things that Candida can lead to is leaky gut. And anytime we have a leaky gut scenario, we have increased intestinal permeability, which increases the potential for inflammatory immune activity reactions. In addition to that, Candida, because of its potential to cause leaky gut, has been linked to different types of autoimmune diseases, particularly because it's not just the Candida causing the problem, but the food proteins that someone consumes, like dairy or wheat, gluten, other types of food proteins, now have more direct access to the immune system, and that can create inflammatory reactions. The other thing to keep in mind as well is that we don't live in a bubble. So things that we're exposed to, from metals to herbicides to pesticides to solvents, these things that also get into our digestive tract can have a damaging effect that can damage the mucosal lining, increasing the potential for Candida to become problematic, but other bacteria as well. And so these slides come from a very good article from a Dr. Vojani called The Role of Exposomes in the Pathophysiology of Autoimmune Diseases. And so both the internal environment and the external environment have a relationship in our overall immune system's ability to recognize and neutralize various toxins, and in some cases have an overexuberant reaction that leads to inflammation. Now, Clostridia bacteria in the various types, particularly Clostridium difficile, is a major infection within the digestive system. And so our host response to the Clostridia can also be robust. And so typically Th17 and T regulatory cells are part of the adaptive immune system. And when we have elevated T regulatory cells, we generally have some type of intestinal homeostasis against different opportunistic pathogens. When the microbe becomes overabundant, in essence, or the chemicals that it's producing become problematic, we start to drive the adaptive immune system to something called Th17, and Th17 actually has a suppressive effect on T regulatory cells. And so Clostridium difficile is a classic bacteria that is involved in mucosal infections, but Candida is as well. So when we get damage along the epithelial lining, What ends up happening if the damage is severe enough, we get a release of what are called DAMPs, danger associated molecular patterns. And these are different chemicals that get recognized by different pattern recognition receptors that are part of our innate immune system. So monocytes, macrophages, neutrophils, dendritic cells will recognize these DAMPs as a trigger of some type of problem. The same thing happens with what are called PAMPs, pathogen-associated molecular patterns. These are basically molecular patterns of microbes that our innate immune cells recognize through their recognition receptors. So again, if the reaction is very severe, it can actually lead to necrosis, and this itself can also be a trigger for autoimmune reactions. We know that Clostridia forms spores, and these spores are part of its infective process. When the spores are moving through the small intestine, when they get down to the last part of the small intestine called the ileum, they encounter bile that was produced by our liver. Bile helps to degrade the spore, and as the spore is degrading and as it's moving into the large intestine, it's producing or releasing different toxins like toxin A and toxin B, which are the main virulence factors of Clostridia difficile. And one of the things it can trigger is Clostridia difficile induced diarrhea, bloody diarrhea, inflammation, and fever, but it can also lead to something called pseudomembranous colitis. And this was actually established, this recognition, back in the late 70s. And pseudomembranous colitis can be a life-threatening inflammatory bowel disease condition where somebody is forming these pseudomembranes over lesion sites within the large intestine. And that can, again, lead to leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability, inflammation, diarrhea, bleeding, etc. Whenever we get damage along the lining of the digestive tract, we have the potential to lose the mucin or mucus layer thickness that helps to create the boundary or border against opportunistic pathogens or pathogenic pathogens that might interact with the epithelial cells. Also within the mucin layer are things like secretory IgA, which are part of the immune system. So as the mucin layer thins, we're now exposing these antigen presenting cells like a dendritic cell to a higher amount of different microbial pathogens or even food peptides that might be harboring or basically sequestering in the digestive tract. And when we lose the mucosal integrity of the digestive tract, we now have a leaky gut scenario where different antigens, things that trigger an immune response, can now more easily pass through the mucosal barrier and engage these different types of antigen presenting cells. The main one being a dendritic cell. The dendritic cell is called the professional antigen presenting cell. And what it does is it delivers an antigen message to a naive T cell. This naive T cell is sitting in a regional lymph node where that dendritic cell migrated from, and based on the antigen and based on the chemical signaling and the co-stimulatory activity, it can drive different types of T helper cell responses. Now, typically with extracellular bacteria, like would be lining the lining of the digestive tract, including Clostridia, or fungal infections, we're going to get a ramp up of Th17 cells. And when we get too much of Th17 activity, we run the risk of inducing autoimmune reactivity. And when we get too much Th17 reactions, it can cause a downregulation of T regulatory cells. And so it turns out that Th17 is inhibitory to T regulatory cells. T regulatory cells are important for immune tolerance, for lymphocyte homeostasis, and regulation of the overall immune response. And so T regulatory cells have an inhibitory effect against Th17 cells. So what's happening within the digestive tract is critical. And so most people don't have just one type of pathogen. They usually have microbial imbalances, microbiome problems, Clostridia bacteria, which weakens the immune system or triggers the immune system in ways that can also then contribute sometimes to fungal problems or vice versa. So the reestablishment of normal microbiome status is critical in any type of intestinal pathogenic environment. And so the microbiome becomes a big component of any types of interventions for intestinal problems. But the microbiome isn't just related to the health of the gut. The microbiome is related to the health of the organism, the rest of our body, because the microbiome has influences on the brain and nervous system, on the immune system, on mitochondrial activity, for example. So we get into this information and more in great detail in our Clostridia Mastery course offered through Integrative Medicine Academy. So for more information about the Clostridia Mastery course, go to clostridiamasterycourse.com. Now this is a 6-module course on functional and integrative medicine concepts that are linked to various Clostridia bacterial infections. We spent a lot of time on Clostridia difficile. We look at a few other types of Clostridia bacteria as well, and understand that Clostridia problems are more than just a gut problem. There are other influences of Clostridia bacteria on the brain and nervous system, on fatty acid metabolism, that have a broad ranging effects in those with inflammatory bowel disease, but also autoimmunity, mental health, neurological problems, autism and special needs, and more. So again, clostridiamasterycourse.com. Well, thank you. Again, I'm Dr. Kurt Wohler for Integrative Medicine Academy.